My name is John Bartlett, and I'm the director of Marist Fashion. And I'm so happy to be joined tonight by my good friend, Emil Wilbekin. And Emil, you and I are both from Cincinnati, Ohio. So I know that when we met, it was basically love at first sight because us Midwestern guys in the big city, we have to stick together. So, but I would like to introduce you, Emil. Emil Wilbekin is the former Vibe magazine editor-in-chief, former chief content officer of Afropunk, and you also worked with Essence magazine as well. And you just, in the last couple of years, were a producer and a writer for the film, the documentary, The Remix, Hip Hop and Fashion. And again, I would really love to welcome you. Emil, before we begin, so what we're going to be doing tonight is talking about the history of hip hop fashion, the convergence, the renaissance of hip hop fashion music, and how it has inspired and influenced the world of high fashion. And we're going to talk about your years at Vibe magazine, which was a very, very special time in both the fashion and the music world. So just tell us a little bit about where you come from, what your background is, and how you found your way into your career.
So thank you for having me, John. This is it's like I love catching up with old friends, and especially my homie from Cincinnati. So I'm from Cincinnati as well. And I went to Hampton University, which is a historically Black college in Virginia. And when I went to school, I wanted to study fashion. And they didn't have a fashion department. And so I ended up, my parents were like, oh, we don't know if we want you to be a fashion designer because you may not make money being a fashion designer. Now, this was a long time ago. And I was like, yeah, but I really love it. So I ended up going to Hampton and studying mass media arts. And the thing that was great about it was Hampton has one of the greatest media departments in the country. But what was even better is I met all these amazing people from New York City and New Jersey. And so I befriended them and I would go home like on spring break with them and they would take me to these incredible hip hop parties. And I was just like, it was like a whole other world to me. And so when I graduated from Hampton, I studied in London for the summer before coming to New York to go to Columbia University to go to the Graduate School of Journalism. When I was going to Columbia, I would also go out at night to all these clubs. And so my teachers were like very fascinated that I would like go out all night to these hip hop parties and then be in class and doing my work. And one of my cultural affairs reporting professors, Samuel G. Friedman, suggested that I start writing about hip hop in grad school. And so that is where it all kind of began. So I started writing about hip hop and the artist and interviewing record executives because a lot of my friends from Hampton worked in the music industry. And then I graduated from Columbia. I worked at Metropolitan Home magazine for 2 years and then was recruited to be one of the founding editors of Vibe magazine at the tender age of 25. And that's kind of where we'll go into the story.
All right, wonderful. So before we start talking about Vibe, which has such a rich history, I just want to go, we're going to share the screen and we're going to talk a little bit about the history of hip hop.
Yes.
So hold, please. So Emil, you please just kind of describe the imagery as we see it, and
Right.
You let me know when you want to go to the next slide.
Okay, sure. So, what I love about the history of hip hop fashion is that it really aligns with the birth of hip hop. So this is the late 70s, where basically Kool Herc, a Jamaican heritage DJ, played a sound system in the middle of the street and everyone gathered and started dancing and breakdancing and rapping and all this stuff. What's really interesting is the story that people never tell us is actually his sister that hosted the party. So we really like to say that Kool Herc's sister is the mother of hip hop. But what was cool about the early days of hip hop was it was youth culture, it was music culture, and it was street culture. And it was basically born out of what was happening uptown in New York and Manhattan and the Bronx and eventually Queens. And it was really about how people represented themselves. And basically, this is at the time where disco is kind of fading out. And disco was like this kind of gender fluid free love. And then suddenly there enters this very hardcore, heavy beat driven music that is based on a lot of Jamaican sound systems and DJing. So it's DJing, but it's also a combination of breakdancing, graffiti, beatboxing. So you can go on to the next slide. And it really defined itself by the way people presented themselves. And so it's basically counterculture. So and you have to think about in the 80s, it was like super preppy. That was what was happening. We were in a very conservative political time. There was, it's very similar to now, actually. There was a lot of kind of racial tensions. There was very Republican government. And then it was also during the crack era. So there was a lot of drug dealing, a lot of dynasty and all that stuff was happening. So people wanted to live very extravagant lives. But then there was also people who were working class that were like young and creative, and they wanted to have their own voice that was very Black identified, that was very kind of inspired by African culture, by Caribbean culture. And so the 5 elements of hip hop is emceeing, which is rapping, and then DJing, which is the 2 turntables and mixing, and then breakdancing, which is this really cool mix of like dance and acrobatics. And then there's also graffiti and then beatboxing. So, Biz Markie, shown here, is probably the most famous beatboxer that we know. But there were so many amazing young people who had a voice, and they wanted to share that voice through the music and the sound, but also how they presented themselves. I will say, when you look at a lot of these photos, it's very hypermasculine. It's very like, you have to think about it. These are kids from the hood. So they are like, they're dressed very tough, but they're dressed very cool. You see they have on like the snorkel jackets, because they're in the streets and it's cold and they're hanging out in the hood. But then you see this woman is a perfect example of like the big door knocker earrings and the jewelry, and then all these wild asymmetrical hairdo, and then the big glasses. So this is like almost like the Black version of kind of like what we saw was happening with Dynasty and Dallas and all this extravagance, but taken through a filter that is very urban and very raw, and very street tough. And then LL Cool J, who was obviously a star at that time. And so a lot of the music, like I said, is from the Bronx, is the birthplace, but it has obviously gone global. But it definitely has a Caribbean kind of undertone to it, because a lot of Jamaicans were in New York. And again, in Jamaica, they have sound systems. So sound systems are these big gatherings with these giant speakers, and they have dancehall artists perform and a selector, which would be the DJ. And so that kind of migrated here and from immigrants and created this sound. And even though, I think what we're experiencing right now with the COVID pandemic, you think about when we've been in the world in some of the darkest periods is when we also have the most creativity. So even though it was the crack era and it was a really challenging time, there was just so much vibrance in the music. And contrary to popular belief, The parties were very mixed. There's a lot of Black people, but there was always a lot of Latinx, a lot of Asian, a lot of white people, because a lot of the white folks from downtown were coming uptown to witness the music. And then a lot of rappers were going downtown to check out all the clubs and hang out with the models and all that stuff. So it was really a multicultural convergence.
I love that.
So one of the things they talk about from the breakdancing are B-boys and B-girls. And so if you notice, the women are still dressed pretty masculine. Like it's going to morph in the future, but a lot of it, again, is this very kind of heteronormative kind of display. And the clothes are very athletic, easy to move, so that you could dance, you could break dance, you could run around. If you're rapping and you're performing on stage, you want to be able to move. But everything, it's like sneakers. Later, we go into Timberland boots and stuff because people are outside. But this is all about form and function when you really look at it. And it's very, very inspired by athleticism. And so you see this heavy athletic influence in hip hop, but also you start to see kind of contemporary sportswear being integrated into the styles as well. The other thing that happened was that while we had, this very profound and provocative music happening, we also had the rise of this Afrocentric movement that was occurring. So this is also around the time where apartheid in South Africa was being challenged. And so Afrocentricity became a very big deal in the United States because Black people were looking for their roots. They wanted to go back to push against, again, kind of society and this kind of white power structure and system that was created. And so while you had dynasty and furs and riches and champagne and the Donald Trump people at that time and Donald Trump, you actually had the pushback of Black people really going back to their roots. And I think in hip hop, because so much is inspired from, I would say, the Caribbean, it is also then really from Africa, because most people were taken from Africa. The slaves were taken from Africa and dispersed throughout the American South, but also through the Caribbean. So again, you start to see this emergence of Afrocentricity and like the Queen Latifah and the Todd Oldham kufi, Salt and Pepper with their kufis. But then it's also when you mix that with the jewelry and then the colors, it's this very, very pro-Black feeling that we start to see. So the oversized. I was thinking about this when we were doing the photo research, and I was like, why was everything oversized? I think part of it was, the pants slouching thing basically comes from when people are in prison, they're not allowed to wear belts. And so their pants would sag. So that's where part of that look came from. I think another part of it is hip hop straddles this line of being very much about the body and then very much about covering the body. So the oversized thing, again, we're in this hyper masculine kind of feeling. And if you look at like Aaliyah and TLC, they're very like tomboy. Like you're not seeing women really showing off their bodies that much. I mean, her midriff is showing, but everything's kind of concealed. And so you think of this idea, I mean, you look at Missy Elliott, it's very like this kind of bro posse kind of look and feel. And then I think part of it too was from, again, there's a whole drug dealer part of hip hop culture that exists, right? So that's where, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but I think part of that as well is, carrying guns and carrying drugs and stuff like that. You needed oversized clothes so you could hide stuff. So it's interesting to see where a lot of the origins of these things come from, but oversized has always been a really big part of hip hop. But you'll also notice that, again, sometimes the top is tighter and more fitted to the body, and then the pants are what is more of the volume. So early stars, I mean, there's so many, like literally, you think of Grandmaster Flash. He was part of the Furious Five, and he has become, one of the ultimate hip hop DJs. I remember at my days at Vibe, which we'll get into later, that he was actually shown in a Louis Vuitton advertisement where Helmut Lang, the designer, had done a DJ case that was all the Louis Vuitton monogram. And it was this really cool image of Grandmaster Flash kind of crouching down on this DJ case. But he's one of the great DJs of the time, or selectors. And then we can go to the next one. Africa Bambaataa, I mean, he was just a force. And again, just his name, right? The thing that was really great, Africa Bambaataa really is like part of the early days of hip hop, but also this convergence with kind of dance music and club music that in the very beginning, you think about Rapper's Delight was really a mix of Chic and their music with the Sugar Hill Gang. So you have this straddling of like hip hop, hardcore, but there's still this edge of like dancing and partying and clubbing. And so African Bambaataa is one of the great forefounders of hip hop. And we can go to the next. And then Run DMC. So Run DMC are like the breakout stars, right? So they're from Queens. But they really, My Adidas was like broke through and became this big moment where you start to see the beginning of the convergence of hip hop music, popular culture, and fashion. So My Adidas, which they did with Aerosmith, breaks through, it blows up on the pop charts. And it really kind of put hip hop on the map in many ways from a pop culture perspective. And then My Adidas, right? Like My Adidas just then suddenly made Adidas like the hottest brand, which it obviously still continues, as we witness with the recent Icy Park drop from Beyonce and her big Adidas deal. But Adidas tracksuits are like staples in hip hop. And if you travel all over the world, I've been to Milan and Paris, underground hip hop parties, you always see people in Adidas tracksuits. Also, again, with the fat gold chains, but then the fedoras, right? Like they kind of give you this like very tailored men's look on the top, and then it gets into the athletic wear, and then the fat gold chains and the gazelle glasses. You can go. And then Roxanne Shantae. So this is when we start to see women really kind of emerging on the scene. And so Roxanne Shantae, young teenage girl, creates this mixtape with Marley Marl, and they play it on the radio, and she's basically battling another rapper. And the thing is like, everyone's like, who is this woman who is spitting rhymes and lyrics like a dude? And then they find out it's this teenage girl from Queensbridge. And so then we start to see this emergence of more of the feminine style. Like, so her hair, you see on one side, she's got asymmetrical hair and the bamboo earrings and the fat gold chains, but then she's still very, again, kind of masculine with the stadium jacket in the next picture, but then her hair is braided, but then the big bamboo earrings. So the feminine parts of hip hop are starting to emerge, but it still has this very kind of hyper-masculine kind of feeling, because I think too, in the clubs, it's like you wanted to be able to move fast and not stand out. And so it's like you'd be sexy at home, but not in the club. So Roxanne Shantae is really one of the founding mothers of hip hop. And, you know, there's also a great documentary about her called Roxanne on Netflix. I don't work at Netflix. Okay. So Salt and Pepper. This is when we really see kind of the glamour edge start to evolve. And you see it in the way that they're dressed, but you also see it in the songs that they're doing. Let's Talk About Sex became this huge hit. And so you have these two rappers and a DJ, and they're still wearing like these oversized kind of leather bomber jackets and jerseys, but they're wearing leggings. So now you start to see more form-fitting clothes. You see that they have more jewelry. Now you're starting to see the hair and then the makeup, right? Roxanne Shantae wasn't wearing a whole bunch of makeup, but now you start to see the glamour part emerge in hip hop. And so Salt and Pepper are really credited with bringing the femininity to the forefront in the hip hop movement. And obviously with all their hits, and they were just very talented, but they could also, again, go on tour with the guys and blend in, but then they really brought this feminine appeal. So Marley Marl, we talked about DJ, producer, just really, really important figure in hip hop, still produces, but really helped kind of amplify kind of the naming. So this is when you start to see people using their names so much in the music, Marley Marl in the house. And this is the kind of the early days where I think when you think about how everyone's name dropping when they speak, or when they're rhyming, or when they're on the turntables, it also then plays into this whole thing of logos, right? And naming. And then you start to see more nameplates and people with the name rings and things like that, or and the bamboo earrings, because our names became very, very important. So that's why I think you will see, as we'll talk about shortly, this alignment with logos and monograms and so forth. But yeah, Marley Marl is another early figure in hip hop who is very, very important in shaping the sound and producing some of the biggest artists of that era. And then LL Cool J. So LL Cool J, then young from Queens and Long Island, brings this other flavor. He's super young. And then he really, you see the nameplate ring. He's wearing the fat gold chains, but he really brought all of a sudden this Kango hat, right? So he is really famous, and you see this almost members only style jacket. But LL Cool J brings this kind of male sexuality into hip hop. And, you know, he's like a hot boy. He's like taking his shirt off and he's got this amazing body, but he's also wearing, so this is the thing that's interesting. Parts of hip hop, there was oversized, but in the earlier days, the guys were still wearing very slim fit jeans. So LL's wearing like tight sweatsuits and he's taking off his shirt and the women are going crazy. So then you start to see this male sexuality emerge into the culture and the scene, which you'll also see evolve when we get into Tupac and other artists, because suddenly this kind of homoerotic sexuality emerges in hip hop through LL Cool J. Okay. So Vibe Magazine. Vibe Magazine started, we did a test issue in 1992. It was the brainchild of Quincy Jones, the music producer. Quincy Jones was approached by this man, Bob Miller, who was a big executive at Warner Brothers and Time Inc. And Time Inc. and Warner Brothers had just merged, and they were trying to figure out how they could create a platform that would merge journalism with, so the Time Inc. history of journalism. So Time Inc. is Time Magazine, Life Magazine, would eventually become Essence, InStyle, Real Simple, Sports Illustrated. And so they went to Quincy and they were like, so we want to combine like kind of your interest in music and Black music with journalism. And what do you think? So he said, there's this really cool movement happening called hip hop. I think it would be great to do a magazine that really focused on hip hop. The idea was, though, that we would show hip hop and R&B essentially, and dancehall and other Black forms of music as rock stars, the way Rolling Stone had done with rock and roll. And so that was the genesis and the idea. And the mission was that we would have breathtaking, beautiful photography and really hardcore, beautifully written journalism in the history of kind of same as Rolling Stone, like great music journalism, but also we would incorporate kind of the history of Black literature, right? So really great, powerful writers with strong voices who were of that era that were writing about their experiences as young Black kids that grew up in the hood, feminists, immigrants from Jamaica, queer people, all who had very strong voices and opinions. And so what was really great was no one had thought about this or seen the world like this. These are some really memorable covers. The Kings and Queens of Hip Hop was actually a cover I worked on. And just to see the artists of that time, I mean, this is in the early days of Vibe, so in the early 90s. And you see it's Lil' Kim, Lauryn Hill, Missy Elliott, Foxy Brown, Master P, Busta Rhymes, Method Man, and LL Cool J, who's much older now in this photo. But this is before they kind of all blew up. I mean, LL was huge, but everyone else was still considered kind of new artists at this time. But then the other thing that was great about Vibe is that we would even have a Whitney Houston on the cover. But Whitney Houston had been on the cover of Essence and some other magazines, but she wasn't really on the cover of Rolling Stone until later. And so here she is, and she's wearing a Gucci outfit by Tom Ford from his first Gucci collection. And then you see the other side is Q-Tip from A Tribe Called Quest, and he's wearing these customized jeans that we collaborated on with Tommy Hilfiger that we were like, we want studs and feathers. And we worked with this really brilliant stylist, Misa Hilton Brim, Misa Hilton, who is has a really illustrious career and came up with Puffy through Bad Boy, and we'll talk a little bit about her later. But this was what Vibe was created to be. It was to show Black hip hop and R&B artists as superstars. So my journey to Vibe, this is some of the work that I worked on when I was there. There's a picture of a very young Beyonce with a very young Emil with a Costume National cutout shirt and white leather belt, and Mary J. Blige. So how I ended up getting at Vibe, I was working at Metropolitan Home Magazine, which was a shelter magazine, and a group of friends that I hung out with, we all love music. And so Jonathan Van Meter, who was a white gay journalist, very, very amazing. He writes a lot for Vogue now, was tapped to be the editor-in-chief of the magazine. And he asked if he could hire some of his friends. We all worked in different facets of magazines. And they said, as long as everyone's qualified, interview them, bring them in. And so I started as the new talent editor. And so as the new talent editor, I was tasked with discovering new talent. So this was, I'm going to age myself, everybody. This was at the time where the new artists that I featured would include Maxwell before he had a record deal. It would include Aaliyah. It would include Usher, Missy Elliott, Brandy, Faith Evans, all the Missy Elliott, every Usher, everybody who was new at that time, I would pick them based on their music, put them in the magazine. And then later you'll see as my trajectory, that came in handy because I eventually become editor-in-chief. And so then I knew all those artists for their whole careers. And so was able to have, to get them to do very cool photo shoots and very interesting stories that they wouldn't do with other places because they trusted me. So while I was at Vibe, in the very first test issue, I was sent a cassette tape from Uptown Records of this woman named Mary J. Blige. And when I received the cassette tape, I fell in love with it. And I ran around the office and I'm like, oh my God, this woman's amazing. She's going to be this big thing. Trust me. And everyone's like, okay. And I'm like playing the music. So I finally get to meet Mary J. Blige and another writer, this really amazing feminist writer named Joan Morgan, who was on staff, was supposed to interview Mary for a new talent piece for the next section that I edited. Mary couldn't do the date and time that Joan could, and then Joan couldn't do the new date, the rescheduled date. So I asked me to do it. So I ended up interviewing Mary for the test issue of Vibe magazine. And so for What's the 411? So by the time her second album, My Life, comes out, I campaign to write the cover story. I had never written a cover story in my life. I had never written anything probably over 1,000 words. And I basically campaigned, and Danielle Smith, who was the music editor at the time, just finally was like, just do it. Like, go do it. And so what ended up happening was, from that moment that I wrote this first story about Mary, and I did the cover, her first cover story, my first time writing a cover story, Mary and I developed this relationship still through the years that I have been able to work with her. I think last count, I have styled her for 8 covers. One of the last covers that I did with her at Vibe is she's wearing a full Tom Ford Gucci outfit and is in his coffee table book. But these are some of the images I styled. She's wearing a Dolce & Gabbana swimsuit on the swing, which everybody at the time was like, why do you have her on the swing? She's wearing a baby fat kind of rubberized dress. And you'll see kind of at the bottom of the photo that it has lace embellishment, like a slip. And then she's wearing a Gucci fur coat. And then the other far picture is her in a Versace slip dress that I did not style, that was actually in Details magazine. But it just shows, I mean, Mary really became the style icon of the time. So what happened was that I moved from the new talent editing, and I decided I wanted to work in the fashion department. And they thought I was crazy. And I was like, I don't care. I want to be the fashion director. And they were like, well, you can't be the fashion director because you don't have fashion experience. And I said, well, what do I need to do? And they were like, we'll let you write your own job description and you figure out how you want to learn to work in fashion. And then we'll grow you into becoming the fashion director. So that never happens. And so that was like amazing. So I came up with this idea to be the style editor. And so what I would do is I would incorporate celebrities into the fashion shoots. And I would also cover the urban sportswear markets and the athletic markets and mix it with high fashion. And so this is when you start to see this mix. So we can go to the next slide. The other person that I met very early on in my career, and that is a very young me, sitting on the bottom of that photo with Little Kim, but was Little Kim. And so Little Kim, Kimberly Jones, when I met her, was part of Junior Mafia. And so we had a really great relationship with Biggie, and Biggie discovered Junior Mafia and all the stuff with Little Kim. And so again, I had this opportunity where I was doing this photo shoot and I wanted to shoot Junior Mafia. And so Little Kim's publicist called us and said, hey, she wants you to put a weave in. She's never had a weave before. And so we put her first weave in for her. And it was this really cool snow shoot. And she had like this snow suit and big hair and all this stuff. Biggie came to the shoot. It was really quite amazing. But then again, there would be this relationship that I would develop with Little Kim. So Little Kim, I think the picture with her with the chainmail dress and the gold long, the $ earrings, I styled that. She's wearing all Versace. We did this other shoot with her with the pin curls. We always try to channel like different glamazon type women that she wanted to explore. And then the middle cover is when I'm editor-in-chief. I didn't style that. Patty Wilson, who is a very brilliant stylist, did that cover with David LaChapelle. And then there's Sean Diddy Combs. So, amazing story. When I become editor-in-chief of Vibe, a publicist that also used to rep John Bartlett, named Paul Wilmot, had this really brilliant idea that for my announcement, we would host a cocktail party. And at the cocktail party would be Sean Puffy Combs and Mary J. Blige. And so they would kind of announce that I was going to be the new editor-in-chief of Vibe magazine. So I met Puffy because he managed Biggie, discovered Biggie. Well, he didn't discover Biggie, but he managed Biggie. And then Faith Evans. And then he was building Bad Boy Records at the time. His claim to fame really came from working with Andre Harrell at Uptown Records. And he really was the brainchild of taking these R&B artists, but styling them and dressing them hip hop. Well, it wasn't just his idea. It was he and his girlfriend, Misa Hilton's idea. And so they would brainstorm and come together. And so that's when you have the emergence of the look and feel of Jodeci, who's this, R&B group, but suddenly they're dressed like hip hop thugs. And that became a whole thing. And so they were also instrumental in a lot of the early styling and direction for Mary J. Blige, as well as a lot of the other artists that were on Uptown Records. Now, Puffy comes from Harlem, and he is the epitome of a Black man from Harlem. He is always dressed to the T. His hair is always immaculately cut. He's always got on the latest, the greatest, the eyewear, and everything is immaculate from head to toe, as you see in these photos. And so later, Puffy would go on to create his own line called Sean John, because he loves fashion. And he was like, well, I love fashion and I love Gucci and Versace and Dolce & Gabbana and all this stuff, but why don't I create my own clothing line as a Black designer? So the photo that you see is from the first runway show that Puffy did at Bryant Park. Wasn't at the park, it was at Cipriani. And it was incredible. It blew everyone away because he took all the essence of hip hop, but he combined it with luxury, right? So you see there's, cashmere. I remember there was a beautiful cashmere sweatsuit that I got to keep from the show. And there was a lot of shearling and leather, but everything was really tailored, but it still had this feeling of hip hop and Uptown and Harlem and kind of reminiscent of the old gangsters and drug dealers from Harlem. But he ended up opening a big store on Fifth Avenue across from the public library that doesn't exist anymore. But he's a huge influence on the convergence of hip hop and fashion. And so So while all this is happening, urban sportswear is exploding. And so you really see um, this big explosion of young Black designers that are creating their own clothes. Carl Kanai really started, you see Tupac wearing that. And then you also had FUBU for Us By Us, which they started selling t-shirts out of their trunks of their cars. You later had Aniche, and then you see Jay-Z with Rockaware, and there were all these urban sportswear lines. And they were doing really well and selling millions of dollars, signing deals with Macy's, because people wanted to dress that way. They wanted to dress like their favorite hip hop stars. And particularly if you didn't live in New York or LA, you really wanted to have that look and feel, but you would buy these clothing to dress this way. So this was a huge multi-million-dollar industry that was largely fueled and created by Black designers. A lot of them had big conglomerates behind them, but you really see this influence. And I'll move because I know I'm talking long. So Kimora Lee Simmons, Russell Simmons. So Russell Simmons had a huge company called Fat Farm, which is, again, another big urban sportswear company. And then he starts dating Kimora Lee Simmons, a former fashion model, and she creates Baby Phat. Baby Phat then really signifies kind of urban fashion from a very sexy women's perspective. And so that collection blew up, and you can see right here, I mean, it looks like it's from today. Kimora really brought kind of this high fashion sensibility with urban sportswear. So we can go on. And then Adidas, we talked about a lot. Adidas has been there from the beginning. They've collaborated with hip hop artists. They believed in the music. You see Missy Elliott, Run DMC, obviously, My Adidas. And again, up until recent with Beyonce and Ivy Park. So Adidas is really an important part of hip hop because it is something that is tried and true to hip hop worldwide. So Ralph Lauren. So one of the things that's interesting about Ralph Lauren is, here's this guy, this Jewish guy from the Bronx that wants to create this kind of American aristocracy look. And so what he did was, took kind of waspy, rich aristocracy looking clothing and made it for the masses. Well, hip hop embraced it because for them it was aspirational. It made people feel like success. A lot of it is functional and worked really well. And so there's always been this very interesting dynamic with Ralph Lauren and the hip hop community, but also because one of the first stories that I styled for Vibe was a photo shoot with Tyson Beckford. And Tyson Beckford had become the face of Polo Ralph Lauren. And that was historic because a Black male model had never had a campaign with a big, huge designer like that, which was brokered by his agent, Beth Ann Hardison, who's a powerful force in fashion. We should go. And then Tommy Hilfiger. Tommy Hilfiger comes along. He really embraces fashion. He collaborated a lot with Aaliyah. You see Snoop Dogg, a lot of the rappers, Grand Puba, are mentioning him in their songs. And should have said that about Ralph Lauren too. Polo and Tommy Hilfiger are dropped into a lot of hip hop lyrics. So it becomes part of the culture. And so Tommy Hilfiger was very smart to embrace. You see, that is Destiny's Child, y'all, and the picture with Tommy Hilfiger way back with other members. But yeah, he had a very great relationship and still is a very huge supporter of Black designers and works with, Zendaya and some other young Black designers. And so Tommy Hilfiger has always been there and super supportive of Vibe at that time. So then we get to Dapper Dan. So Dapper Dan in the early days of hip hop basically had this store in Harlem that drug dealers and athletes and gangsters would go to, and he would take the monogram kind of logos of Gucci and Louis Vuitton and MCM and Fendi and recreate it into his own creations. And he would basically figured out a way to screen print the fabric, and basically was creating all these looks. And so one day the feds busted into his shop, and the Supreme Court Judge Sonia Sotomayor was actually the DA at the time, and they broke up his business. But what he was doing was very much reinterpreting what was known as kind of old world European luxury. And so we can go through and look at some of his, so Moschino also did this. Moschino loves hip hop. And so you see the hip hop influence. So what you see start to happen is fashion in the 90s, high fashion starts paying attention to hip hop. So suddenly you see designers like Isaac Mizrahi and Todd Oldham and John Bartlett and other people incorporating hip hop looks into their designs. You also start to see European designers like Moschino, like Dolce & Gabbana, Gucci, and Versace. And so there starts to be this whole moment. You can go to the next slide. And then even Marc Jacobs. So what then happens is hip hop inspires high fashion. High fashion then is inspired by the way the hip hop artists and people of color start wearing the clothing, and there becomes this dialogue. And so, this hip hop collection that Marc Jacobs did a few years ago, some people say, well, this is cultural appropriation. Well, at this point, hip hop is global. So I don't know if it's interpretation or just simply remixing. So we can go to the next slide. When all hell breaks loose is when Gucci, the head designer, Michelle Alessandro, sends this look down the runway, which is completely knocked off from one of Dapper Dan's old looks. And so Black Twitter goes crazy and Gucci's under fire. So they embraced the moment and then collaborated with Dapper Dan, give him his own atelier, and he then starts to design his own Dapper Dan Gucci kind of collection. And so he now has an atelier in Harlem that's beautiful. He makes custom pieces. He has private clients. And he also works a lot with Gucci to make sure, Gucci's kind of had a whole firestorm moment, but they actually recognized it and decided, okay, how do we give back to the community? So part of that was their collaboration with Dapper Dan. They also have the Gucci Change Makers. They're doing internships with young designers. They're doing supporting nonprofits around the United States for marginalized communities. And they're doing all this other stuff. But this is when you really get this dialogue, right? Where this is like the racial reckoning pre-war party, because everyone's like, no, you're not going to take our culture and just rob us of it without representing us in the advertising and the fashion and actually being part of the creative process. So Gucci, I think 2 years ago, had Gucci Mane in the ad campaign, and it was really cool. I actually got to go to Milan to that fashion show, and he was there. And it's just this really great thing where you're seeing, this is kind of like what Dapper Dan bore years ago in the early days of hip hop, where you're having these hip hop artists and these music artists wearing all these cool Gucci clothes, but it's also interpreted differently through the way that they're wearing it. But you see the homage to Dapper Dan with the car, because Dapper Dan would also deck out people's cars with the fabric. And we can go. So Versace was very much embraced by hip hop, but I would have to say that Gianni Versace and then later his sister, Donatella, they were always about rock and roll and music and cutting edge culture. And they really kind of, for them, it was like, hip hop and rock and roll and music were just all a huge part of the conversation. And so here you see, I mean, they have Precious, who's a plus size model. So you see them embracing body positivity. You see Lil Nas X, the first openly gay rapper to win 2 Grammys, and the influence that they have. So they have been very early on adapters and collaborative in that space. And then Chanel is another one. In the days of Karl Lagerfeld, you know, you see the center picture is literally from the 90s. And so that is like Karl Lagerfeld's interpretation of like hip hop. But then on either side, you see Little Kim in a more recent picture where she's paying homage to Chanel because she loves Chanel. And then you see this collaboration sneakers that Pharrell did with Chanel. So he has a deal with Chanel where he designs like these capsule collections and really beautiful kind of cutting edge. He loves Chanel, but it's also what's cool is you see this kind of gender fluid kind of inspiration that Pharrell brings to it. That's very, very cool and modern. And I think after Karl Lagerfeld's death, Pharrell really helps kind of keep the brand cool, keep it to the streets, but also still very elevated. And then, unfortunately, Rihanna's LVMH clothing line Fenty just folded, but she made history with her deal with LVMH as a Black woman. And then the other thing that was really great was born out of that was her beauty cosmetics line, which has like broken records. Like all the cosmetic companies are now looking at her. But this is very intrinsic. All of this is very intrinsic to hip hop. Hip hop is really about entrepreneurship and ownership and kind of having your own voice and say. And now that's amplified through business, through fashion, through cosmetics, through luxury. And Virgil Abloh being the head men's designer at Louis Vuitton. And so he, you know, very tied to Kanye West in the early days, has really kind of turned Louis Vuitton on its head by creating these very, very forward-thinking, modern, futuristic, almost Afrofuturism combined with high fashion. And so he just did a huge collection for men's that blew everybody's mind. And he worked with Ib Kabara, who is now the editor-in-chief of Dazed and Confused in London, but very edgy, very modern, and again, very hip hop inspired. And so through my work for years, I think a big thing for me is about when I was at Vibe, we won the National Magazine Award where we beat out all these big name magazines, the New Yorker, Wired, Jane, and Gourmet. And one of the things that I said in my speech was, and this is like the Oscars of magazines. And I said that, you know, to me, Vibe was about giving voice to the voiceless. And so a lot of my work is always from a cultural perspective about giving people who are marginalized a voice and a platform. So 5 years ago, I started Native Son. Native Son is a platform, community, and movement that was created to inspire and empower and celebrate Black gay men. We are on Instagram at Native Son now, and it is amazing. It started 5 years ago. We have over 35,000 followers on Instagram. We've done events all over the world. We have sponsors like Cadillac, Procter & Gamble, ARP, LVMH. Like, it's kind of amazing. But this simple idea of how do you gather marginalized Black gay men and give them a space and a platform to have a voice and to be seen and celebrated? So when you think of British Vogue being run by Edward Enninful, who is a Black gay man, that is what Native Son represents. So he being on the cover of Time magazine, or Telfar Clemens being on the cover of Time magazine, that's what Native Son is about.
And we're back.
And we're back. Sorry, wow. I was long-winded.
That was amazing. And again, I learned so much. And I also, of course, had the wonderful privilege to be part of that world with you, and to be able to experience a lot of what was going on in fashion at the time. We spent
Yes.
a lot of time in Milan together. And I remember I was really kind of a little bit jealous of you because while I was working, getting shows ready, you were going from one front row fashion show to the next, from Armani to Versace to Dolce & Gabbana. And again, it was such an exciting time because again, there was that confluence, that convergence of all of these different worlds, and you were right in the middle of it.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit again about, I think we spoke about this a little bit in the beginning. You worked on a film, a documentary called The Remix, again, which is about hip hop and fashion.
Yeah.
And I really want to encourage all of the students that are watching tonight to dive into this documentary. I wanted to just ask you a little bit more about that, if you would, please.
So it's such an interesting thing. I've always loved movies. I love the fashion of movies. I love the storytelling of movies. So Lisa Cortez, who's this really amazing Oscar-nominated producer and director, called me and said that MCM wanted to create and fund, well, they didn't want to create it, they wanted to fund a documentary about the history of hip hop and fashion, but they wanted it to be through the lens of women. And so I thought, oh, cool, you're calling me. And so, Lisa knew that I was in that whole convergence of hip hop and fashion. And so literally I said, the centerpiece needs to be Misa Hilton. So she is the lead kind of character and the protagonist in the film, and it centers around her story. But we were also very lucky to get, Dapper Dan is featured in it. Kirby Jean Raymond is featured in it. April Walker, who developed Walker Wear. And then there's all these talking heads. So Bevy Smith, who worked with me at Vibe and was one of my partners in crimes and co-conspirators. Mimi Valdez, who worked with me at Vibe, who later became editor after I was there. And all these really brilliant women, Kimberly Drew. There's all these really powerful women, and it's telling the story of hip hop and hip hop fashion and the development of it, but through the lens of mostly Black women, and then also through the men that also paved the way. And so I was brought on to be a co-producer and a co-writer. We had to film it in a year, which was crazy for a documentary, but it debuted in Tribeca Film Festival in 2019. And then last summer, Netflix acquired it, and it's performed really, really well. So if you have a Netflix account, I would encourage people to watch it. It's hip hop. It's The Remix, hip hop X fashion. And it's really, really a powerful story of coming up through the ranks of this very hyper masculine, misogynistic, kind of homophobic culture, and women really paving the way and knocking down the doors as they typically do.
I love it. That's amazing. So we do have a few moments for questions, and I have a couple of questions from students, but if anybody does have a question, you can either raise your hand or send it through the chat feature of Zoom. So one of the questions that I got from one of my students, and you touched about it a little bit, how do you feel about the idea of cultural appropriation? Because we speak about this a lot in fashion in general, when a designer takes something from a culture that is not theirs, or they're shown wearing something that is from a different culture. And there was just something with Rihanna because she was dressed like the god. Oh shoot, it's not coming to me. But there's a lot of that going on.
Yeah.
Now, how do you feel about that? Because the culture of hip hop is so widely, it's part of our language now.
Yes.
And so where does it become appropriation and where is it appreciation?
Right. I think, as we live through this racial reckoning, it's really challenging, right? Because you think about people dressing up in blackface, or people dressing up as Indians or geishas, and making fun of them. So I think that's where it gets tricky, right? Because fashion, in its true sense, you want to draw inspiration from wherever you're inspired. But I think what this racial reckoning is challenging us to do is, well, what is your experience, right? Like draw from your culture, from your background, from your intersections, and pull in that way. I do think collaborations and appreciations can be done. I think they have to be very thoughtful. And you also have to like kind of consider, well, am I bringing in an Asian historian, right, to really help tell this story? Am I collaborating with young influencers who are Asian to help like collaborate with us versus just taking the stuff and being like, here it is, right?
Yeah. I have another question. This is from Bria Royer. The question is, what qualities as a person do you think helped you achieve so much over the course of your career? So what are those qualities that you really feel helped you to experience everything that you've experienced thus far?
I think that I have been really blessed and I'm really just lucky. I think that I show a real curiosity. So when I was able to meet people, I ask a lot of questions. I think also I'm a dreamer, right? Like I dream of these crazy photo shoots. I mean, I did this Hitchcock photo shoot with Biggie as Hitchcock, right? And like Foxy Brown was like in the bird scene. And like when I called their management to pitch it, like I thought they were gonna laugh me out the door because I love Hitchcock. And they all said yes. So I think that I say that dream, have crazy ideas and manifest them, because I think a lot of times we're like, oh, that's too crazy, I can't present that. And then when you actually can present it, maybe someone will see it. And so I think that's part of it. The other thing is I'm a little pushy. And I think sometimes, quiet doesn't always work and you have to advocate for yourself. I remember being called into Jonathan's office at Vibe and being chastised because they were like, you're junior and you're so vocal and constructive criticism, and like you're too young, you shouldn't be saying all that stuff. And I'm like, so you want me to dim my light and quiet my voice? And I think we live in a day and age, especially with what's happening right now, where people should use their voices.
Beautiful. Here's another question from Rowan D'Souza. And the question is, so I'm currently an aspiring hip hop artist, and I'm currently at a point in my career where my following is spreading more and more. I was wondering if you could give some insight on how to brand yourself as an artist. What are the steps into making your image in social media in the industry as more professional?
I love this. So I think that you have to be very clear about your brand. What does your brand represent? And then what does that look like? And how does that align with your music, right? So how do you look different than Future or Drake or whoever, and then Gucci Mane? And then how is that music different? And then in terms of social media and branding, you lean into that. Whatever your look and feel is, then you stick with that and you are like strong with that and you kind of amplify that. And then make sure that that messaging is consistent across all social platforms. So your logo, what are your hashtags that you're using? And it's almost like it's going to seem redundant to you, but if you keep just putting those same hashtags out and the same messaging and the look is always consistent, it works. That's what all major fashion brands do. You find your look and you stay in that lane.
I hear you. And I think that that's so true. You have to keep circling around the same ideas. Now, there was a question, a hand raised by Cecilia Hines. Yes. Cecilia, did you want to unmute yourself? I'm going to allow you.
I didn't know how to do that. I apologize. I just sent the question, but I was curious because I know that, listening to a lot of old school hip hop, there's just so many like homophobic messages and beliefs throughout the community. And I understand too, it's a lot of the roots with my grandparents are actually Jamaican immigrants, so I understand that like being a member of the LGBTQ community, it's difficult to kind of get their acceptance and everything. How is that for you working with, these artists who essentially didn't agree with, or had all these like remarks and everything about the gay community?
Right. Well, thank you, Cecilia, for that question. That's such a great question. So I did fail to mention, I mean, being an out gay man when I was editor-in-chief of Vibe, I was a little like, oh my gosh, like what am I stepping into? But the thing that I leaned into was that hip hop is about keeping it real. So I was like, I'm keeping it real. I'm a Black gay man and you have to deal with me. And so I made sure to kind of infuse more content around LGBTQ and queer issues into the magazine. I would not allow any homophobic remarks and misogynistic remarks or transphobic remarks in the magazine. And the artists, for the most part, like a lot of that is performative. Like most of those people are not like that, but I would challenge them, right? Like I would challenge them in the meetings when they would play the music. And I remember there was one artist and I went back to the record label president and I was like, you can't put that out. Like that is horrible and it's homophobic and it's terrible. I think I was ahead of my time about kind of living in my truth. And so a lot of that's kind of how I'm known too, though, is like I really pushed back against white supremacy. I pushed back against homophobia and misogyny and transphobia. And now I'm pushing back on ageism.
All right. So we have one final question from Natalie Ford. As a Black fashion designer, do you think that Black designers have been boxed into the hip hop, or do you think that they can? Let me start that one over.
That's okay.
And Natalie is a Black fashion design student. As a Black fashion designer, do you think that Black designers have been boxed into the hip hop, or do you think that they can be seen in other ways?
So I definitely think that Black designers are shown in other ways and have shown that. I think that what Virgil is doing, I think it's very forward. I think what Kirby Jean Raymond is doing, Christopher John Rogers. I mean, there's so many Black designers. I mean, look at what First Lady Michelle Obama wore. I'm still saying First Lady at the inauguration. And so I think you have to, I think you can allow yourself to get put in a box, but fashion is so vast and dynamic and experimental right now. I don't think that everyone is. I think you're actually seeing more influence of African inspired design, luxury, and you think about like Laquan Smith and what he's doing. I think there's parts of it that are Black that are related to our culture, but you're seeing now more, I think, diverse representation of, like, for instance, what Kirby does is kind of a mix of everything, right? It's kind of, he has his Reebok sportswear line, but I wouldn't say that that's specifically hip hop. But then when he does his kind of ready to wear clothes, it's really beautiful fashion. And then he'll get, Nicolene Thomas or Derek Adams to paint or design some of the fabrics. So I think that we allow ourselves to get boxed in. We can't let other people box us in.
And one final question from Mark Palmer. Can you talk about the intersections between hip hop, fashion, and politics?
Yes. So thank you. That's such a great question. One of the things to me that I also love about hip hop, and it goes back to the earlier question about being LGBTQ, is that hip hop was super vocal and did push back against police brutality and social justice very early on. I mean, you think about Public Enemy and NWA and Ice-T. There was all this pushback, and I think it's quieted a bit over the years. I think that it's become a bit complacent, but I do think that historically, Black music in general, if you think about Black music as rock and roll, because we started that, and you think about protest music, and you think about dance hall reggae and Bob Marley, you think about Marvin Gaye, and then you look at rap music. I mean, Black music is a political statement. Being a Black artist is a political statement. And so it's been very, very integral. And then with fashion, you know, Kirby John Raymond thought his whole business was going to go down the tubes because he did a Black Lives Matter collection that was panned, and his buyers stopped buying because they were like, we didn't sign up for this. We want what you did last season. But he made a decision to put his political voice into his collection, and look what's happened to it now. And I think the same thing has happened with a lot of hip hop.
Thank you, Emil. So that's all the time that we have for this evening. I really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I want to thank you on behalf of Marist and the Marist Fashion Department. You've been such an awesome, awesome guest. And I hope that you will come visit us when school opens up. And I know that the students really, really enjoyed this. So Emil, if you could hear all the applause.
Applause, applause, applause. No, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening. I'm grateful to share.
I learned so much, and I really do. There's a book here, there's another movie, there's a lot, and you got to live it, and I'm so glad that I got to live some of that with you.
Thank you.
So again, thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Right. Thank you, Emil.
Thank you.